Literature can focus on non-religious subjects but still have a religious message. Today on television you see cop shows, you see vampire shows, and many of these have an underlying or an explicit religious or moral message which we, because this is our culture, just kind of take for granted. And we don't think of the possible religious message, unless we're religious studies professors, in which case we might analyze it, as a colleague of mine once did. When we're reading sagas, there are similar messages, but we may miss them because we are not actually familiar with the culture, and therefore we don't pick up on it. Today, people of a Catholic background are more likely to pick up on some of these things than Protestants or atheists, for example. I once wrote an article on the death scenes in the sagas, which pointed out some of this, and the topic has been picked up again in a book, hopefully forthcoming very soon, by Haki Antonsson, and he addresses the same issues in much more detail, looking at specific descriptions of how people die in the sagas and showing what the implications of those passages would have been for the culture of that time. I mean, we may not realize that they have any implications. We just say, oh, well, this is just a really bloody description of how somebody was killed in a violent manner. But as Haki points out, there's more to it than that. And the very violence may actually be part of the message which would be taken away by the original hearers.
In the Christian law section of Grágás, the medieval Icelandic law code, the following clause is found on the reception of a funeral procession. A householder is required to board a man who is taking a body to be buried with 4 other and a horse or draft animal if they have one with them. If he refuses them, he is fined 3 marks, and the case lies with the man who is refused lodging. The summons is to be made locally and 5 neighbors called at the assembly. This has an obvious relevance for the story of the group of men who carry Þórgunnar's body to Skálholt in Eyrbyggja saga.
But the story of Þórgunna is a classical example of how secular literature can be used to convey a Christian message. The law code Grágás requires farmers to provide lodging for 2 specific groups of people. A third is eventually added, but we'll skip that. Those are people taking children to church to be baptized and people taking bodies to be buried. Okay? The punishment for not providing hospitality for such people is a fine of 3 marks. Now, we can imagine that some farmers were rich enough that they didn't care about 3 marks. And maybe they were powerful enough that they knew perfectly well that the impoverished burial party was never going to take them to court. So why should they bother about what the law told them to do? They might ignore it. However, if there was even a chance that that corpse that you had refused to host the burial party might actually get up and start cooking dinner for them, you might think about things a second time. In Eyrbyggja saga, we're told that things went smoothly for the burial party for the rest of the journey because, as the narrator comments, wherever this news was heard, people thought it advisable to show them whatever hospitality they asked for. So a good ghost story is a much more effective way of getting your point across than just, a sermon from the pulpit.